Night School.
Night School.
So today we're going to be talking about Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl. I've read this book a couple times recently and just want to share some of the highlights from it and some of his theory of logotherapy, which is like a school of psychology that he founded. Mm-hmm. So Viktor Frankl was an Austrian Jew who was in the concentration camps during World War II. Him and all of his family were taken into concentration camps, and he spent, I believe, like 3 years in concentration camps. And so this book, a lot of it is sort of chronicling his time there and some of his experiences that he had in the camp. And he says in the book that this is not meant to be like a full account of like the horrors of the concentration camp, or it's not meant to be like a full exploration of just like everything bad that was going on there. It's just some of what he experienced to help make the point about what he wants to say about how you can find meaning in any sort of situation and how suffering can be something you can legitimately value and appreciate as something that helps make you a deeper person.
Cool.
And that if you can bravely suffer through something, you can become greater because of it. So the book is kind of split up into two parts. The first part is his account of being in the concentration camp. He was in Auschwitz, Dachau, and two others that I can't remember the names of. And then the second part is an exploration of logotherapy and kind of explaining that.
Yeah.
So to start, I'll just tell a little bit about like how he ended up there. First of all, he was a person who was already a doctor and a professor at the time, and was working on a book before he ever went into the concentration camp, working on his first book. And he saw the writing on the wall that I don't know a lot of World War II history, but people were aware that like these camps were coming, and if you're a Jew in this area, you're going to get scooped up and you're going to end up there. And he had the opportunity, because of his position as a professor, to escape and to leave for America, but he decided not to do that because he didn't want to abandon his parents and the rest of his family that was still there in Austria. And there's an interesting story about how he had been speaking with his parents, and he had noticed that they had this old piece of stone, and it was from a temple in some other city that they were from. And the piece of stone had a number on it, a Roman numeral number, and it was from a tablet that had the 10 Commandments on it. And that particular number was the commandment about honoring thy father and mother. And he took it as a sign that he should stay and try to do as much as he could to help his mom and dad through the situation.
Yeah.
So he willingly did not leave when he could have left. But he did not understand exactly how bad that situation was going to be, or just like how much death would be involved in that. But he kind of willingly took this on because he didn't want to abandon his parents. Unfortunately, they did not end up making it through the concentration camps anyway. So he talks about when he was first taken to the camp, there's like a very simple, like, there's a guy standing there and just looking at every person and pointing to the left and pointing to the right. If you go to the left, it means like you're not useful, and you go to the ovens. And if you look like you could be useful, you go to the right and you get to work, which is what you want to do, but it's the horrible situation. And so there was just people always a big part of trying to survive through the situation was attempting to always look very strong and very smart, and like you're healthy and like you're in good shape. So he was able to get through that despite being a little older than some of the other people. I'm getting the sense that he was like 40-ish. He never actually says his age specifically in it, and I should have looked that up. But he's older than a lot of the other people that were like allowed to continue working. One guy that he met in the camp, who was somebody that he knew from outside from before, had like rushed into a room, like snuck into a room one night and explained to everybody how important it was to shave every day, because if you shave every day, you look a little bit younger. And even if you get like razor burn, it'll add a little bit of color to your cheeks, and it'll just make you look a little bit more vibrant, just bring a little bit of color to your face. So much of like getting through it, he talks about, is just like attempting to look strong and healthy even when you're suffering, because you need to just like put on a strong face, even if like you don't have shoes anymore and it's extremely cold. And he tells some I mean, it's all sad story, but he tells sad stories about how like you do find yourself doing kind of low key things to get other people in situations, like to be unnoticed. Like people, he described it like it's just like when you're sheep, like how sheep are in a herd, all the sheep want to get to the middle of the herd because that is the safest place to be. I've never heard that before, but that makes perfect sense. But that was the exact same type of thing they would do. Just try to be noticed as little as possible and try to get to the center of every group so that you will not be the person who gets hit or anything like that.
Yeah.
He talks about capos. Capos come up a lot during this. I had not heard of... I've heard of this idea before, but just not the term. But basically prisoners that are made like guards. And so they just end up doing the same kind of cruel stuff that the guards are doing, even though they are Jews that are locked up there in the exact same way. But they get extra privileges and act cruel to all the other Jews that are there. And those were like the people that they hated more than anything, the ones that were willingly going along with it.
Yeah.
Although it's all kind of the same thing. Like they're kind of in the same situation as well. And if they didn't play that part, they would be stuck in the same position as everyone else, or just killed for not being willing to play that part. So I don't know how much more damnable it is than anybody else.
Yeah. But it would be more offensive in the moment.
For sure. Yeah. He talks about how occasionally, so these people were obviously they were used for slave labor, and they were basically rented. They were rented out to construction companies that were doing different sorts of projects, and sometimes these companies, it sounds like the employees of these companies would be a little bit nicer than the guards and then the capos, because these people like probably didn't feel great about this in a different sort of way, because they're just doing business, but like it's really ugly business that they're doing and getting very cheap labor. So they would get coupons they would give coupons to the people that were working for them occasionally if they did a really good job. And those coupons would be to get like 6 cigarettes, but then each cigarette you could trade for a couple of scoops of soup. And then that's what people mostly did with them. And so if you saw somebody actually smoking their cigarettes, it meant like, oh, this person's given up. What they would later call give up-itis. So like if somebody's smoking their cigarettes, it's like, oh, they're not thinking anymore about trying to survive this. They're just
not
trying
even going for food, in other words.
Yeah, they're just trying to feel good right this second. So anybody smoking a cigarette was a very bad sign, unless it was the capos, because they would get a lot of coupons every week. Yeah. A lot of people would run at. They had a slang term. They just referred to killing yourself as running at the fence, because there was like electric fences, and like that was a very popular way for people to just be like, no, I'm done. They just run and slam into the fence and get electrocuted that way on purpose. He talks about how even in these situations, people would still do artistic things. Like there would still be like performance art that people would do. Occasionally people would like just when they're eating the bread that they did get or the soup that they did get, somebody would get up and just like start singing, and there would be some of that. And there was still goofing around. There was still like jokes that got made at their own expense, just joking about how like when we're out of here, it's going to be hard not to yell the things that, not to like yell the things that we yell all the time here. Or there was one they said where one of the capos was, one of the prisoners was saying to one of the other prisoners, "Man, I knew that capo when he was just a lowly manager of a bank. Look how high he's raised in the world." Just yeah. So they'd still find ways to goof around and would like deliberately try and come up with silly stories to amuse each other. He said that he would try to make a list every week of every time that he had any sort of pleasure. And he said his worst week there was only 2 on there, but there was always something. There's always something that you could pick out. He talked about how, like, after a few weeks, the idea of seeing people suffering or sick or dying became just like absolutely uninteresting. Like it affected no emotion after a few weeks. It was just like, oh yeah, they're dying. Like everybody is dying. And it just became completely uninteresting to him. And he was at sometimes helping with medical things as a doctor.
Yeah.
He said he became absolutely numb to it. One really interesting thing I read on the Wikipedia page for Viktor Frankl, it wasn't in the book, but one thing that they had him doing in the camps was they were having him do operations involving methamphetamine to bring people back to life. They were like killing people with other drugs and then having him attempt to like resurrect dead bodies using methamphetamine and something else. I don't know the details on it, but I know that the Nazis were up to very weird things.
Yeah,
in a lot
transpersonal kind of experiments.
Yeah, magical type stuff. And so if I'm understanding it correctly, they were doing like Frankenstein-esque experiments where they're literally trying to bring corpses back to life. Very weird.
People who had been dead for a while, or like right when they die, try to resuscitate them right after they die.
I don't know how long after, but I think that they were dying in the presence. So like I think it was pretty close to right after. I don't know how long after though. Like I don't know if they were cold. I don't know if it was like that long or anything. I'm not sure on that. Yeah. He talked about how it became like you would just see people die so often and that you would just become totally used to the idea that as soon as somebody died, everybody would like just start swarming the body and taking the things that were useful about it. Like maybe these shoes are a little bit less useless than my shoes.
Yeah.
Or like the people would even take like they would find strings, like pull strings from clothing and stuff that they could find useful for other little things. They would just steal anything off the body that seemed like it could be useful, and then it would get carried out.
Wow.
And he saw a lot of that when doing medical work because he was he talked about how often there was beatings and how what was most hurtful about it was how often it was not just like the physical pain of it. It was how like ridiculous and unreasonable the motives were for them. Yeah. Like there was a guy that's carrying a very heavy girder and
what's a girder?
A big piece of steel, a big long piece of steel. And he tripped. And Viktor jumped in to try and help him because he was not carrying anything at the time. And they beat him for that. But that guard had told him, like, get back where you're supposed to be. Like, that's not your job. But then that guard 2 minutes earlier was saying that he couldn't believe that they all lack the spirit of comradeship. And so then, like, immediately he does exactly what the guy was just criticizing him for. And he just sadistically hits him for the opposite thing. And just finds something else to do.
He somehow found the unfairness motivating the violence more offensive than the violence.
Exactly. It wasn't what hurt him most was like, well, I couldn't possibly have won here, which is like, of course you couldn't possibly have won here, but just being reminded that like, no, there is no win. This is completely unreasonable. You're sadistic and you can do whatever you want to do.
Right.
Yeah. he talked about how there was at one point one of the things that people would do to try and get through this situation was try to warm themselves to one of the guards, to like get on good terms with a guard. And he had that with one of the capos. And he became like, because he was a psychotherapist, the capo would use him as like a sounding board for like his problems with his wife and just any other stuff that's going on with him. So he was being used as a psychotherapist by this capo, and he was getting favorable treatment for it. One of the things he talks about is like there would be these big pots of soup, and so it'd be like pea soup, but there's not a lot of peas in there, and the peas are all at the bottom. So depending on whether you're favored or not, it's
Where would
either
the scoop?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Am I getting a scoop from the bottom or am I getting a scoop off the top? Because you're either getting water or you're getting peas.
Right.
And he would get bottom scoops when that capo had some sort of control. He also talks about how there were guards that were legitimately kind and that were risking themselves to do kind things. He only talks about one in the book. He says like there were many, but one that I want to mention is a guy who nobody knew it at the time except for one of the doctors, but this guard was spending his own money and sneaking medicine into the place to help try and save some of the lives of the people. And only one doctor knew about it and didn't talk about it until afterwards. But
wow,
some of that was going on. Yeah.
Right.
Because of his positive relationship with that one capo, at one point he was invited to a room where they were doing a seance.
Really?
They did a seance to try and summon a spirit, and a guy was trying to do automatic writing, and so
yeah,
he wrote when they were doing the seance. His hand started moving, and he wrote the phrase "Vae Victis," which is Latin and means "woe to the vanquished." So like, I'm so sorry for all the people that died, that sort of thing. And that guy said that he had never heard that phrase before. He knew nothing about Latin. Interestingly, Viktor Frankl is not open to anything like that. And he said, like, in my opinion, surely at some point in his life, he did hear that phrase and he just forgot that he had heard it and it came out of him in that unusual setting. So he's not very open to the idea that there was a real anything going on, just a trick of the mind sort of thing. But yeah, seance is going on.
Weird.
Yeah. He talked about how he would find himself talking to his wife in his head all the time, that he would think about his wife all the time and wonder where she was. And at times, he said she was almost certainly like less than 1,000 yards away from him in the same camp, but just completely inaccessible because they're just kept in a totally separate part of the camp. But she wasn't far away, and he felt like he was talking to her. Unfortunately, she also did not end up making it through the concentration camps. So he says that like he doesn't know if she was dead or alive at the time that he was talking to her, but that he felt her and that he felt like he was really connecting with her and it was helping him get through it.
Yeah.
He talked about how at one point he had a guy next to him. That I should say the sleeping situation was there was like wooden beds, but they were very small, and there would be 9 men to one wooden bed, and they would have to share 2 blankets. So they were all just essentially 9 spoons put together.
Jeez.
And that's just what they did. And he said that like that did have its benefits. Like the warmth did help a lot. Like sleeping together like that did help a lot. And that anybody who had ever been like a light sleeper and who had struggled with noises or anything, like it just there would be a man snoring directly into your ear, 2 inches away from your ear, and it just meant nothing at that point because you were so tired and you were so used to those people at that time.
Right.
He also talked about how like there was nobody ever had a sexual thought when they were in the concentration camp. There wasn't the energy for that. There was just too much else to think about.
Yeah.
It wasn't even possible to have that sort of thought. Nobody did. But at one point, one of the men that he was sleeping with in the same bed was having like a horrible nightmare. He could tell. And he went to wake him up, and then he stopped himself, and he told himself, like, there's no way that what he's dreaming about right now could possibly be worse than what I would wake him up to. Like, whatever he's going through right now, I better just leave him there rather than bring him back to this.
Wow.
Yeah. He talked about how he was like when working in the medical unit, like there would be so little medicine that was actually offered to them. They would have like 50 aspirins to use for all the sick people over the course of a week. And so they had to so often make pragmatic decisions about like, you're probably too far gone. There's no point in giving you any medicine at like way earlier points than would typically be done in the real world where like medicine's more abundant. So just how many sad decisions like that he had to make all the time.
Yeah.
He talked about how at one point they were being transferred from one camp to another camp, and they were driving by the town that he was from. And so their train was going right past where he was from, and he was begging to get to the window and to be able to like look out the window to look at the town. And everybody like very meanly told him, "You got to live there for years. Why would you get to see it? Like, we want to see it." Which is such an insane backwards way, but it just turned people into that like they're just so much looking out for themselves in that situation.
Right.
Which is very sad. And there's a lot of instances where he kind of talks about how selfish it often made them.
Yeah.
How much it did feel like you need to try and save yourself, even though you know that every time you save yourself, it means someone else dies. Like that was so commonly a part of it. Like, yeah, you can become a favorite of somebody, but that means that you're taking somebody else's spot because there's like limited spots to get out of here.
Right. You know what I can't stop thinking about because I feel this theme in the things you're choosing to share, that it's impressive and noteworthy how caught up they get squabbling over such small things, the unbelievably impoverished conditions that they just get used to.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I found a string. That's something. Or, oh, there's 3 peas in this bowl of soup. That's something.
Yeah.
And I can't stop thinking about the ways in which we are that impoverished relatively. Like in what ways are we, and in that circumstance, they were forced temporarily to live under conditions where that level of poverty was the ceiling.
Yes. Yeah.
We live in conditions where there's really no ceiling, and yet because of psychological frameworks and limiting beliefs, we place ourselves under incredible poverty compared to what we're capable of, compared to what we could have. If we had no imposter syndrome, no insecurity, no jealousy, no resentment, the incredible wealth and creativity and everything that we'd be capable of compared to what we settle for.
Yeah.
With no walls around us and nobody saying that we can't have more. Well, all sorts of people saying we can't have more.
Sure.
But not with any authority. Isn't that weird?
Yeah. And I guess I want to like clarify what you mean a little bit, because like I do think that there are some like legitimate limitations that are placed on us now. Like I do think there are people that have more power than you and I have, that have more money that you and I have, that manufacture scarcity in a deliberate way. Like diamonds are not something that should actually be scarce. That's a deliberately created thing.
Yeah.
So in some ways we are not like, obviously we're so much freer than them, but we are still like put into a situation where there is artificial scarcity and where we are I mean, this could go pretty deep, but like, I think that we are forced to work much more than we would actually have to work if not for things like scheduled obsolescence and
scheduled what?
Scheduled obsolescence. That's the idea that like products are made deliberately bad so that because when we first started making ovens, you make an oven, the oven lasts forever. The oven doesn't break. We now make ovens so that they deliberately break after 10 years or whatever it is. And the same can be said for phones and for so many different products that we have.
Yeah.
Because if they didn't do that, we wouldn't have to keep working all the time.
Yeah.
So there's things like that, and there's just deliberate problems that are created by our governments and by the people in power to keep us squabbling over too little when there are people with so much more.
Yeah.
So I do think there's some reality to that, but yeah, I get what you're saying. Like at any level, like that same sort of thing happens. Like, is that just, I think I've lost your point a little bit originally. What was your original point?
Well, my point was that it's fascinating to see how easily the human mind can be conditioned to live under what previously seemed to be unthinkable poverty, and how quickly it can be normalized.
Yeah.
And that makes me realize that if that's human nature, then you and I certainly right now are living under conditions of poverty that are totally unnecessary.
Yes.
That we're choosing because of limiting beliefs.
Yeah.
And psychological frameworks.
Yeah.
And that seems worth thinking about because, like, if what would we do? And I'm not saying we should actually get into this conversation. I'm just saying that it's a question worth posing.
Yeah.
What would we do if we looked around ourselves at all the conditions of poverty that we live in and realized it's not necessary? Like we would be just fine if we were much more successful and wealthy and creative and healthy in all ways than we are right now.
Yeah.
And the conditions that we settle for are completely insane because we are, oh, there's 3 peas in my soup. This is a string. We're that insane in some other way.
Yeah.
So that was my point, was just that that's worth thinking about. And then your point was that greed and scarcity and jealousy and all the negative human qualities also manufacture scarcity that's unnecessary. So those conditions are imposed on us to a much less extent than they are in the book.
For sure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can really, it sounds like they really got used to that sort of life very quickly. Like it became very normal to them very quickly. Things that are just like, that are like so heinous and disgusting to read about now just was like their life.
Yeah.
He talks later in the book after he's already out of the concentration camp about how he's shown a picture of a very sick man sitting alone in one of like the cabins that they stayed in at the camp, and someone had showed him the picture, and like it was like the face of this man, and they're like, "Isn't this so horrible?" And he was like, "No, it's not." And he explains that like, no, that's a guy who's having relatively a really good day in the camp because he got to stay home and he got to just sit there and wait for bread at the end of the day because he was kind of sick that day. So like and he's like hearing whistles going on outside and having one day where he doesn't have to work. And in that situation, that man, although his face looks very sad and he's very emaciated, he's having a great day. Because it's just your perspective is so different when you're in that situation.
Yeah, that's a trip.
Yeah. He talked about how there was a man that he knew there who had a dream, and he had this dream in February of 1945, and in the dream he was meeting with what he thought was an angel or something like that. And it told him, "I can tell you anything you want to know." And he asked, "When will this war end for me? Like, when will I be able to be free?" And the angel told him, "It's going to happen on March 30th. And the man was just like in such a good mood and so like looking forward to that. And then as it got closer to that day, it was not looking like that's when it was going to end, because they would hear little bits of news and rumors about what was going on in the war and like whether it was likely that the Americans were going to come anytime soon and get them out of there. And and on March 29th, the man got sick and he started getting a fever. And then on March 30th, he like went unconscious. And by March 31st, he was dead.
Damn.
Like, and you could either take that as, was that a prophecy of when his death was, or was that a situation where he just lost the will to live at that time? Which I guess kind of ties into a lot of the point of one of the big things that he talks about in his explanation of logotherapy later is the idea of that often phobias and neuroses are self-perpetuating and self-causing. If you are worried about something happening, it's likely to happen. But if you're not worried about happening, it's less likely to happen.
Yeah.
He talks about like people with stutters. If you are nervous about your stutter, you're going to stutter. And he talks about how this man that had a stutter, the only time that he didn't have a stutter was when he was wanting to ham his stutter up for sympathy's sake. Then he couldn't get himself to do it. Yeah. Or
the wires are crossed, so he just opposite of whatever signal he puts out comes out.
Yeah. Or a guy who like had horrible sweating when he was nervous. Then he would get nervous that he was going to sweat, which would make him sweat. And he told this guy, like, no, what you need to do is when you are in a situation where you think you might get nervous, start thinking like, I'm going to sweat so hard. I'm going to sweat gallons on this one. Try and show them how much you can sweat. And then they don't sweat at all. Or people with like, with sexual dysfunction. Like if you're trying too hard to get it up, you're going to have a hard time. You have to just not even think about it, and then it's when it happened. But when you're overthinking it all the time is when that starts becoming a problem. So that situation with that guy and with March 30th, maybe that was something that he created in himself, or maybe it's just that when that day came, he just could no longer have anything to look forward to and just had to die then.
Yeah.
Yeah. He talks about how much, or one more thing about like being in the camps. He talks about how at one point when he left, I believe it was when he was leaving Auschwitz and going to Dachau, he heard right afterwards from a guard or from a capo that cannibalism had just broken out on the camp that he had left. Like people were starting to like break legs off of corpses and like sneak them off because that's how bad it was getting. Which I guess it's kind of course that would happen eventually. I had never heard that before, but yeah.
Yeah, that one's rough.
It's really dark. Yeah. He talks about how one night in his cabin, people were particularly low because of some bad news that they had gotten about the status of the war, and they were in a situation where like they didn't even get to eat that day because someone had stolen some potatoes and no one was willing to rat out who had stolen the potatoes. So then they all just got starved for a day. And he talks about how people were particularly low, and he had to give like a speech to his cabin to try and cheer everybody up because somebody put it on him to do it. And even though he was low, he like gave this rousing speech about his logotherapeutic ideas about how important it is to have a will to live. And something that I really liked from that was that he asked them, what have we actually lost up to this point that we can't get back? And realistically, he put it that like we all still have our lives. None of our bones are broken. We have all of the same skills that we had before, and in some cases more skills now. All of the like our positions, our jobs, we'll be able to get those back afterwards. All of our clothes and stuff like that doesn't really matter. We'll be able to get more clothes later, and put it in a way that actually worked to these people and like had people crying by the end of it, and was able to cheer people up in a particularly dark moment by explaining to them like, this is all, we've actually lost nothing that we can't get back.
That's amazing. That's
now,
the real test of, do you have anything meaningful to say? It's like, well, do you have anything meaningful to say to these people
that's
right
a tough
here?
one.
Or, yeah, because like a lot of conversations about religion go in directions like that. Like, well, what are you going to say about incredible suffering and stuff like that? It's like, well, that guy clearly figured something out because he had something to say in those conditions.
Yeah, yeah. And as for like things he had lost as well, it reminds me that when he first got there, he had a scroll of paper on which he had been writing the manuscript for his first book, which he was very excited about. And he like tried to beg the guards to like let him keep his book. And of course they did not let him. But he found himself while in these concentration camps basically rewriting that book in his head.
Right.
That was one of the things that drove him to have the will to live during the situation, was that he felt he had this important work that he had to do. He felt that he had to get out what he needed to say about logotherapy and to have this book done, as well as getting back to his family, his brother and sister, his mom and dad, and his wife. And but that was one of the things that kept him going. And at one point he had typhus, which I don't totally know what that is, but it's some sort of disease that involves a fever.
Okay.
And he was finding, like, he had found a couple of little scraps of paper where he was like just writing in really tiny words his book and just like trying to write out parts of it just to keep himself going.
Right.
So that was something that he felt that he really needed to keep when he got there. But then while there, realized that he could continue writing it just in his head. He could continue thinking about it and continue developing it. And of course, it made it so much deeper having an experience like what he had here.
Yeah.
Yeah. He gives the account of when they were able to finally get out. Eventually, the Americans had made it like all the way to the camp. And even then, it was a really sketchy situation. Him and one other guy had started an escape. They were like going to try and escape and then get to the battle lines. That was something that was going on near the end of the war, where people thought that like maybe the Allied forces that were opposed to Hitler were getting close. And if we can get out and we can just make it to that battle line, we'll be safe there. And so they had begun to try to escape, but then heard that the Americans were coming and then went back. And so they didn't end up even actually doing the escape like they had meant to. But even then, there were people in the camps that were being like told like, yeah, no, we're going to have to turn you over. Like, just wait here in this cabin. And then some of the guards were like locking the cabin and burning people alive in cabins, like just still on like right at the end, like still people were just getting randomly killed right at the finish line.
Right.
And then he talks about how when they were finally being like marched out of the camp, they would see the guards were there having quickly switched out of their guard uniforms into street clothes again, and were like giving cigarettes to the prisoners, like as they're being let, like now being kiss asses, now trying to change their tune and trying to like win as much goodwill with the prisoners as possible.
In order to be more likely to get accepted by the Allied forces and brought out of the situation instead of killed? Or
probably. Yeah.
Like that?
Yeah. Trying to look better to the Americans, trying to not look like the monsters they had been behaving like for some time. Yeah. And we're trying to
Russians or like Soviets too.
The people rescuing them could have been Soviets. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Very possibly. He didn't mention the Russians or the Soviets at all. He mentioned that it was Americans that were coming there at least. But I mean, it's very possible that it was like a mix of people, but the Americans were just the ones that people were talking about. They were the loudest. I'm not sure. So they were finally able to get out and able to return home and to find who was left to actually see at this point. And the vast majority of them had died. He found later that the odds of his survival were 1 in 29.
Wow.
And unfortunately, his mother, his father, his wife, and his brother had all died in the concentration camps. But he did have a sister that survived as well. So that ain't nothing.
Yeah.
He talks about like the effect that it had on the prisoners after they were home, like how often they became cruel people on the other side of it, how often they felt that they had been treated so poorly that they needed to treat other people poorly at this point, as though there was some sort of debt. He tells a story of how he was with one guy and they were walking somewhere, and then where they were trying to get to, between there was a farm where there was like fresh crops that were planted, and the guy just started like stomping through the crops, but they're like baby crops, and so he's like destroying them. And Viktor tries to tell him like, hey, we shouldn't be walking there. And he like grabs Viktor and pulls him in, and he's like, haven't we suffered enough? Do you really think we can't? You really think it matters that I'm crushing a few crops after all I've been through? Like just looking at it, like the world has been so horribly unfair to me that how dare you tell me I can't be unfair to somebody else at this point? Even in such a small way, it's still like he felt entitled to that. He felt entitled to destruction because he had been so destroyed through the situation.
Right.
Which is very sad and makes sense. I can totally see how people would get there. Hurt people. Yeah.
Like he had decided that he had ample evidence that life was a bad enough thing that it was okay to turn against it.
I guess so. Yeah. That's one way of looking at it. Yeah, like he was just so... He felt that like the world was evil. And I mean, this might have been a man that had no family left at this point. He had lost... He had lost everything that he had before, at least everything physical, you know.
Yeah.
And so it felt justified to him.
Yeah.
That was pretty much the account of his time in the concentration camp and how it seemed to affect like the people that he had been with there. And then he talks, the second half of the book talks about his idea of logotherapy, and which references the Greek word logos as he defines it. I've heard it translated other ways, but he defines it as meaning. So what he believes is that you have to have, that the point of life is not about pleasure or about happiness, that the point of life is to try and find meaning in things. And a lot of this book, I'm not sure if I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about this book specifically before.
Right, me neither, because he always talks about Solzhenitsyn and the other one.
Dostoevsky?
Well, there's another concentration camp survivor with brilliant insights on his experience, something like that.
Yeah, like Gulag Archipelago, I think, is the book that you're thinking of.
Yeah. I guess it's just Solzhenitsyn.
I think so, yeah.
This is on his list of books everyone should read, though.
Is it?
On his website, yeah.
Nice. Solzhenitsyn? Or is that what you said?
Man's Search for Meaning.
Oh, yeah.
Jordan Peterson.
Yeah. So, but a lot of the ideas in this book, a lot of the like logotherapeutic ideas, it all felt very familiar to me because of how much Jordan Peterson I've read and listened to over the years. The idea basically being that like the point of life is to find something that makes life worth living. And he breaks that down into three primary categories. One being work. Like he talks about how there were people that were in the concentration camp whose reason to try and get out of this was because they felt that they had something important that they had to do on the outside. He talks about how there was a guy who had been writing a series of books, and he felt that nobody else could finish his series of books, and it was very important that he get out and finish his book series.
Yeah.
He talks about how there was a couple of men who had said that they were basically suicidal and that they were giving up because they felt that there was nothing else in this world for them. And he said that he was able to turn them around on that by explaining to them that maybe there is something in this world that needs you. Like maybe there is nothing else that this world is going to give, but there is something that only you can give to this world.
Yeah.
And you need to stick around so that you can find what that is. Because there is something unique that only you can do.
Yeah.
So yeah, finding some sort of work that gives your life purpose, that makes you feel like only you could do something like this. And so you need to be here.
Yep.
Love, having some connection with a person that you couldn't imagine leaving behind. And that, like, for a lot of people, that's what it was. For a lot of people, it was thinking about their children that were on the outside that they would really like to be able to see again and would want to be there for.
Yeah.
And talks about how he talked quite a bit about love and about how, like, I guess this is kind of a side note, but about how, like, you have to, like, fully accept everything about a person to be able to love them. And it made me think about just the idea that, like, in a way, this is pretty off topic, but just in a way, when you love someone that much, and because of that, you feel it's very important that you stick around and you continue to live. In a way, it's like what you love is the combination of the two of you. Like, you love that connection between the two of you, and you can't imagine that connection going away.
Right.
And maybe you would also die for that person because you would rather they stay alive than you stay alive.
Yeah.
But yeah, in a way, like, when you love somebody that much, it's like you love the two of you together, and you would hate for the world to be deprived of that connection between the two of you.
Yeah, that combination. Yeah, that's a beautiful thought.
Yeah. And he talks about, which leads me to another thing. He talked about a client that he had later in life who had been really, really suffering because his wife had died. And that grief was just destroying him, having to deal with that. And he told the man, "Have you thought about, like, how she would feel right now if you had died, and about how, like, what you are doing for her by being the one that didn't die first, and how you are having to bear this burden?" And that just completely turned the man around and made him realize, like, oh yeah, I'm happy. Like, it means something. It now meant something to him that he was bearing that burden, because if he was not bearing that burden, she would be bearing that burden, and he would hate that more than bearing the burden himself right now.
Yeah.
The third thing that he said can bring life meaning is suffering, just like suffering on its own. And the ability to find in yourself that you can bear that suffering, in some cases, can be enough to give your life meaning. That he felt that there were...
I hate that idea.
That he felt that there were people that were in the camp that simply... The fact that they were able to get through this, and that they were able to see in themselves the ability to get through this, was enough. And he kind of gives some caveats.
But that sounds like he's saying that the courage to suffer is meaningful, or the capacity to perceive dignity in yourself despite suffering or something is meaningful. It sounds like some quality that they possess despite their suffering is giving them the meaning. I absolutely despise the idea that suffering is meaningful. What were your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, like I guess the way he put it is like suffering courageously, like being able to suffer and find that, like, you are strong enough to get through even that, just as a test for yourself kind of thing.
Yeah.
And he does also say that, like, you should not create suffering in your life deliberately.
Okay.
And it made me think of David Goggins, who
this is the kind of shit I can't stand, dude.
Yeah, for people who don't know, he's a man who does insane ultra marathons, and to the point where, like, he's like breaking his feet and, like, continuing to run. He's like, there's something wrong with him.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, I mean, it's amazing, and he's very encouraging. He's very inspiring in a lot of ways. But I was also thinking about, like, when I was reading about the suffering part, I was thinking about Viktor Frankl, being exposed to David Goggins and how much he would like hate David Goggins.
Yeah.
Like, what do you do? This is crazy. Like you're like, even he would be like, this is
Maybe
insane.
David Goggins is one of the guards and he's trying to make up for it.
maybe. But yeah, that was the one that he talked about the least. But yeah, he said that he feels like that can be enough for people to find meaning in their life.
Yeah.
Just showing that like, I am strong enough to overcome even this.
Mm-hmm.
And he brings up the idea that Nietzsche says that what does not kill you simply makes you stronger. And if people view it as something that makes you stronger, that can be enough to get them through it.
Yeah, fair enough.
He also brings up another Nietzsche quote, many times in the book. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how, which just ties in so perfectly with all of the logotherapeutic ideas.
Yeah.
And he talks a lot about how he feels that, because he wrote 30 something books like that during his life, but this is the one that's like the massive hit that anybody who like is aware of Viktor Frankl, like this would be the book that makes them aware of him originally.
Yeah, right.
And how he feels that the reason that this hits so hard is not because of how good a book it is, but he thinks like how that people are extremely desperate right now for meaning, which is funny to say right now because we're talking about a book that was written in the 50s. So it's not now, but it is still now. It is. I mean, it hasn't gotten better. People are still like clamoring for meaning in their lives.
Yeah.
People are still struggling with that. And I think that it's probably the same reason that someone like Jordan Peterson has hit so hard as well, because he's talking about that sort of topic. But
yeah,
he gives a lot of credit to the idea that there is an existential vacuum in the world right now. And this book got so popular because it's a great title, and people just really are searching for meaning so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess this is the last little thing I wanted to share. What he views as the categorical imperative of logotherapy is to live as if you were living already for the second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now. So
that's fire.
it's a really good way to say YOLO, like go for it, like don't have regrets.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I think that the idea of logotherapy, although it didn't shake me hearing about it, reading this book, because this book was written quite a while ago, and so many of these ideas have resonated with so many people that I feel like I've heard a lot of it before.
Yeah, they're like firmly in the zeitgeist now, especially in the kind of intellectual dark web zeitgeist.
Sure. Yeah.
Peterson's friend Vervaeke put out a big podcast series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. It was so good. And it wasn't really along these lines in terms of content, but just, in that same stream of, in that same purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. So while it didn't like shake me, it definitely, it feels like very good advice. A lot of what he said did resonate with me, and very little felt like false or untrue to me.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot more to his account of the concentration camps. If people are interested in that, it's a very well written book, and that's pretty much all I wanted to share from it.
Great.
Did you have any questions or?
Nothing comes to mind.
Okay. Night school.
Night school.